Greetings and welcome to our final session of Lesson 3A Notes on Eastern Orthodoxy in recent decades and centuries. And this video will look at Eastern Orthodoxy in regions beyond Russia, outside of Russia. And we'll begin with Greece and the Balkan countries that are just to the east of Western Europe, and issues that they have faced. In the 1990s, there were several wars after the USSR fell. Different groups were trying to gain power and territory, and so many Christians and Muslims were fighting each other. There was genocide. The U.S. even sent troops over to help stop the conflict and create a peace process. The former Yugoslavia was broken up, and several smaller countries exist today because of the conflicts during that time. In the 2010s, there were some serious economic challenges in these countries and also a growing secularism that has impacted the church. One of my former students from BCA spent a few weeks in Greece and neighboring countries and reported that only 2% in some of these countries of the population actually are active in attending church. And not just American evangelical churches, but even the Orthodox churches. And so many of these countries are much similar to what we saw in Western Europe as being part of a post-Christian culture. In the Middle East, where there are also many Orthodox Christians, a much smaller percent of the population after centuries of Muslim rule, but there are pockets of Christian populations that can trace their heritage back to the early church. They too have had many problems from Muslim extremists. Sometimes the Muslim extremists are in control of the government, such as when ISIS took over much of Iraq and Syria, and there were frequent and terrible slaughter and persecution of Christians. At other times, Christians are technically and legally supposed to have freedom of worship. They can't spread their faith or be very public about it, but they should, at least in theory, be allowed to worship in private. Yet, in many of these countries, Muslim extremists target these Christians, and the government does little or nothing to protect the Christians or to go after the extremists. So, particularly in Egypt, where there are many Coptic Orthodox Christians, there have been mass killings, churches being bulldozed, various terrible things, and many times the perpetrators are unpunished. So there are actually two videos after I'm done speaking I'd like you to watch about these challenges of Christians in the Middle East. The first one is called Christian Persecution in Egypt, and it'll review some of the events that I shared. Parts of the images are graphic. It's just to give you a warning, and it chronicles tragic events that have happened in the past 10 years in churches around Egypt. The second video is called Forgiving ISIS. It's by an organization called Samaritan's Purse. Many of you have supported this organization and its ministries when you help with the Operation Shoebox at Christmas time, where you pack shoeboxes and send them out around the world to people in need. Samaritan's Purse does many other ministries, and it had people on the ground trying to help churches and communities that were in ISIS-controlled regions. And you only need to watch the first 2 minutes and 40 seconds of that video. If you want to watch the whole thing, that's great. But the first 2 minutes and 40 seconds are a powerful testimony of the challenges Christians faced under ISIS and why the love of Christ needs to triumph over pain, suffering, and bitterness. Finally, Orthodox Christians have also struggled in Israel, not necessarily because of violent persecution, although sometimes that happens in more Muslim-controlled areas. But as Jewish settlements have taken over land in an attempt to reclaim the Promised Land, many of the Christian areas have been taken as well. And so, for instance, in Bethlehem, which has had a large Christian population since the time of Constantine, there's now almost no Christians left there. And Christians who are left are facing economic hardship and are sometimes vandalized as well. So overall, there are many things that we should be praying for the Eastern Orthodox churches, praying for those facing persecution, whether violent or, as in Israel, more economic and social, praying for the churches to stand up against hatred and war, as there are many conflicts that affect the population still, as for instance, Russia taking over Crimea has caused tension in the Ukrainian and Russian Orthodox churches. We can be praying for the churches to regain prominence amidst secularism in Greece and Balkan countries. Eastern Orthodoxy has had a rough go at it, and sometimes I'm not sure what to make of the challenges they've faced that have caused them not to be able to flourish in ways that we've seen in Roman Catholicism and in Protestantism. But I do believe there are brothers and sisters in Christ, and that their suffering and their endurance of all this suffering has much to teach us. So again, watch those videos on forgiving ISIS and Christian persecution in Egypt. And I hope that you will take some time during this quarantine, during this Lenten season, to pray for our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters, and perhaps ask yourself what God might be calling you to do to make a difference.